All right, so we are in Genesis 15. Mom reads my Facebook or remembers where we were. One of the two. And what I'm going to do today, because we have about 3 weeks worth of material to cram in. Yeah. So we're going to just read through Genesis 15, and then I'm going to go back and make some comments and read you some stuff from some of the people that I've been quoting along this journey in Genesis so far. So some different scholars and the addition of a new one. After these things, and so remember last time Abram got into the war defending Lot, and he wouldn't take money from the spoils of war because he didn't want anyone to be able to say, oh, I made that guy rich. Okay, that's the story. So after these things, the word of the Lord, or the word of Yahweh, came to Abram in a vision, saying, do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, and reward shall be very great. This is significant that he says, do not be afraid, first thing right after he's been in a war. Okay, so it's an entrance, it's a theophany of God, and some things that we're going to note along the way here, and then we'll just read the whole thing, but watch the characterization of the word of the Lord, okay? So the word of the Lord, or the word of Yahweh, came to Abram in a vision, saying, do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, and your reward shall be very great. Then Abram said, O Yahweh, my Lord, what will you give me? I continue to be childless, and my heir is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, look, you have not given me a descendant, and here a member of my household is my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, this person will not be your heir, but your own son will be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, look toward the heavens and count the stars if you are able to count them. And he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And he believed in Yahweh, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. Now, I'm kind of interchanging Yahweh and the Lord on purpose, just so you kind of remember that anytime you see that, that's the word that's actually in the Hebrew. So, and he believed in Yahweh, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. And he said to him, I am Yahweh, who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give this land to you to possess it. And he said, O Yahweh God, how shall I know that I will possess it? And he said to him, take for me a 3-year-old heifer, and a 3-year-old female goat, and a 3-year-old ram, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon, and a partridge in a pear tree. And he took for him all these, and cut them in pieces down the middle, and he put each piece opposite the other, but the birds he did not cut. And the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. And it happened as the sun went down, then a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, a great terrifying darkness fell upon him. And he said to Abram, you must surely know that your descendants shall be as aliens in a land not their own. And they shall serve them, and they shall oppress them 400 years. And also the nation that they serve I will judge. Then afterward they shall go out with great possessions. And as for you, you shall go to your ancestors in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And the 4th generation shall return here, for the guilt of the Amorites is not yet complete. And after the sun had gone down and it was dusk, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between those half pieces. On that day Yahweh made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I will give this land, from the river of Egypt, this is not the Nile, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates River, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Okay, so there's our chapter for today. Be blessed and filled. Thou art dismissed. Contemplate the mysteries of the word. Obviously, so I kind of foreshadowed a little bit to watch the characterization there that happens with the word of the Lord, because this happens throughout the Hebrew Bible, and this is the first time that it happens, I believe, in this way, where it starts with, it says, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying. Okay, so there's the word of the Lord comes saying, and this is the rhema in the Greek translation, is what they use. It's the rhema of the Lord, so it's a spoken kind of word. So the word of the Lord comes and says something, and then Abram says, O Yahweh, my Lord, to the word. And then Abram says, look, you haven't given me a descendant. And then again, it comes and it says, the word of Yahweh came to him saying. And then right after that, in verse 5, it says, and he brought him outside and said. Who? Because who's in sight just before this? The word of the Lord. Okay, so there's some personification going on to this word of the Lord. And that doesn't necessarily mean that every time we see that phrase throughout the Hebrew Bible that there's always personification with it, but there is a lot of the time. And so that is important for us, like when we read John's prologue, and John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay? John's doing a bit of Greek philosophy, but he's also doing a bit of biblical interpretation. And he's talking about who this character seems to be. You know, this word of the Lord character. Okay? And this was an ancient belief in Judaism, and it was renounced as a heresy 200 years after the crucifixion. That there was a physical kind of corporeal version of Yahweh that would appear, and then the spirit version that nobody could see. And they called it two powers in heaven. And it was an okay doctrine until Christians came around with their Trinity and started mucking things up. And so they renounced it as a heresy at a formal Jewish council. And that's not to say that they're wrong for calling it a heresy or you're wrong for believing that. It's just that's what it was. And I tend to think that we should read those that the church calls heretics. Because generally speaking, when an organization that is linked up with an empire is threatened by something, you know, there's good reason for that. Okay, so now let's get into some of the stuff that's going, because this is a big chapter. It's covenant, you know, and we've all heard this chapter taught, right, in our Word of Faith churches and all that and the covenant-based churches, you know. So this is one that's big in a lot of people's minds, and it's big on the whole subject of covenant in the Bible, right? Comes from the Abrahamic covenant. Yeah, there's a covenant with Noah, and there's kind of an Adamic covenant, but not really. And so there's other things going on, but the Abrahamic covenant is like the big one, okay? And this is where we are. So in 15:4, we get this introduction of the word of the Lord. In Hebrew, it's the Dibar Yahweh. In Greek, it's the Rhema Kuriou. And then this word is He, right after that. And then later on in the chapter is identified directly with Yahweh, right? So the word is talking and He says Yahweh to it. So there's something going on there that it's something more than just thing. So, in the story, Abraham is having an experience with more than one facet of God simultaneously. Does that make sense? I hope so. Good. If it doesn't, chuck something at me and ask a question. And then we can go down to 15:7. Now, how many of you know that this is before Exodus? Nobody. Wow. And you know where I'm going, don't you? Because Moses goes and he asks God, what's your name? And God says his name to Moses, and then Moses goes and tells the Israelites, Yahweh has sent me. And that's like a long time after this. And so where does the name Yahweh come from? You know, if he hasn't revealed his name to them yet, why is it here? Okay, so there's multiple theories to this. One, which is kind of the boring, generic, historical, critical theory is, well, that's a later insertion from an editor. Well, yeah, that could be. It could also be an even more boring, but probably true grammatical thing going on there, because when God talks to Moses, God doesn't say, my name is Yahweh. The word for name in Hebrew is Shem, so, you won't hear that in the phrase that I'm about to say to you. And you also won't hear Yahweh. When Moses says to God, what is your name? He says, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. Does that have Yahweh or Shem in it anywhere? No. So no, my name is not Yahweh. That's not what he says. Ehyeh means I am. And Asher means who, that, which. And then Ehyeh, I am. I am what I am. You know, whatever I am. That's all. He's not giving him a name. He's not answering his question. He's basically saying, that's what I am. I am what I am. Well, when Moses goes to the people, he says, oh, Yahweh has sent me. Well, where does that come from? He said, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. Shouldn't he be saying, Ehyeh has sent me? You know, like, why does he change the name to, well, because it's a verb. And in Hebrew, they conjugate the verbs out in such a way that the third person masculine form of Ehyeh is Yahweh. So he basically is saying he is. He doesn't really say his name. It becomes God's name later in Jewish history. Okay, so the story itself is packaged around the grammatical idea that God's name isn't ever really revealed. It's just, he says, I am. You know, and they turn that into a name to say he is, but he is what? Well, there's a particular grammatical form, and I'm not going to get into all of it, but the name Yahweh in this particular form means he is who causes to be. So we can kind of sometimes take, and especially if we're in the old parts of Genesis, and we see the name Yahweh, you know, we can kind of take that as the one who causes things to be. They're not trying to name God, they're assigning some grammar and using a verb to talk about God's activity. Because, and this is most of Israel's idea when they write, is it's God's activity in their history that they're writing about. Or from their point of view, God's activity. Okay, and then on this 15:7 again, like I said, we got a lot to read, so hopefully we'll be out of here by about 2:30. So last time I brought in a pretty wild insertion from the Targums, right, about Og of Bashan riding the ark. And if you haven't read this, it's in Targum Pseudo-Jonathan. I'm pretty sure you can find it online for free. And Og escapes the flood because God's killing the giants in the flood, right? This is the story. And Og is one of these giants, and he escapes the flood by riding the ark and living off of the stuff that Noah had brought for himself. This is all in the Targum. It's a great story. And then he is the one who comes to warn Abraham that this battle is going on and that Lot has been kidnapped. Why? Because he wants Abraham to be killed. Because Og is a descendant of a demon spawn who doesn't want God's covenant to come to pass. And so this is all in the Aramaic translation of the Old Testament. Well, one of them. Okay, there is no the translation. And so you see a bit of how they're doing interpretation along, and you know, most scholars will call a Targum something like a commentary today. It's just that today we have the, I guess, scholarly awareness and kindness to the reader to put the comments below the text. And in the Targums, the comments are in line with the text. So as you're reading it, it just becomes a part of the story. Okay? And so a good translation, what they'll do is they'll have, like, in bold, they'll have the original text, and then in italic, they'll have all the comment. And so there's a lot there. But anyways, all that to say, that was a kind of example of one way that the Bible has been interpreted along the way, and how people fill in the gaps that they perceive. Because, see, the Bible says, oh, the one who escaped came to warn Abram. And ancient interpreters thought, well, who is that? Like, why does the Bible... So they have to have an answer for everything. The Bible, nothing in the Bible is by accident for them. So, well, who is the one who escaped? Well, in one particular translation, it's this guy. Okay? So what we're going to do here is we're going to read from Philo's Questions and Answers in Genesis. And Philo, again, is an ancient Greek commentator who converted to Judaism and wrote all kinds of stuff about the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, Greek Testament. You know, I can't remember everything that he writes. But anyways, he says, what is the meaning of the words, I am the Lord God who led thee out of the land of the Chaldeans, to give thee this land to inherit? The literal meaning is clear. That which must be rendered as the deeper meaning is as follows. Now, Philo is famous for his rendering of Scripture in three ways. And there's kind of like the literal, what do the words say? What do they, if I say I ran to the store, you understand from that the literal meaning is that I went to some store to get something. Okay, but the metaphoric meaning is that I took a car, I didn't literally run. I used ran in a metaphorical sense. Okay, and then the allegorical meaning would be something like the running to the store signifies the fact that we were out of milk. It's like it means something else than what it says, but it still can be interpreted from or extrapolated from the text, okay? So that's kind of Philo's big deal. He says, that which must be rendered as the deeper meaning is as follows. The land of the Chaldeans is symbolically mathematical theory of which astronomy is part. And in this field, the Chaldeans labor not unsuccessfully or slothfully. Thus he honors the wise man with two gifts. For one thing, he takes him away from Chaldean doctrine, is in quotes, which in addition to being difficult to seize and grasp, is the cause of great evils and impiety, and attributing to that which is created the powers of the Creator, and persuades men to honor and worship the works of the world instead of the Creator of the world. And again, he grants him fruitful wisdom, which he symbolically calls land. And the Father shows that wisdom and virtue are immutable and without change or turning, for it is not proper for God to reveal that which is able to admit turning or change, because that which is revealed should be and remain unchangeable and constant. But that which is the subject to change and is wont to always be fluid does not admit of true and proper revelation. So basically what Philo's saying here is, yeah, you can take land as a literal promise if you want to, but what you can also do is say that God has plucked Abraham out of the mindset of the Chaldeans, which is problematic, and we'll talk about that in a second, and plopped him into a new way of thinking. Okay? So this is kind of what Philo is saying. This is the allegorical interpretation of this text, is that God will take us and pluck us from our old way of thinking and put us into a new way of thinking. So Philo doesn't go too far from how some in the church history have interpreted this. But again, that is not anything more than an example. Biblical interpretation is done in community, and interpretations are supposed to vary. And that's why we have so many problems in the church today, is because they're not allowed to. Right? We have like doctrinal documents that if like you have to check these 11 boxes to call yourself this. Well, that's silliness. That's what creates denominations. If we were allowed to just interpret and let's let the text say what it says and then be good Jesus followers and interpret it. And sometimes you got to interpret it creatively. I got no problem thinking that, and I hate saying it this way, but if Jesus were here today, if Jesus were alive today, no, if he were like here as the incarnation happened in our day and age, I have no problem thinking that Jesus would not have an issue with archaeological data upsetting what he thought about the Old Testament. I don't think he would be like, well, God's word is true, though every man be a liar. He'd go, oh, that's fascinating. So how do we interpret this? And this is what I've said before. When data rubs against the plain, flat, literal reading of the Bible, it's not the data that's wrong. It's the plain, flat, literal reading that's wrong. And it's the way that we're reading it, but even more than that, it's the way that we're interpreting it. Okay, because you can read all you want, and the issue that I have, and I frequently get myself into a little bit of trouble with people who, well, I just want to read my Bible. Well, that's fine, but understand that no matter what you read, you're always reading an interpretation. Because these words don't mean anything in English. What we're doing is we're trying to, when we make a translation, and part of what I do when I study is I try and do a translation of my own based on, some well-documented ways of translating biblical Hebrew. And the word Elohim, it gets translated as God, but it doesn't mean God. It means Elohim. And it's just that the idea that Elohim encompasses kind of matches up with what we call God, but it actually doesn't. Because Elohim is like a king, and he's a landowner, ruler. You know, there's more to it than just the idea of God, as we have this ethereal, distant deity. But God's the best word that we have to translate that word with any kind of like ease, you know, and not make our Bibles like, you know, there's like volume 1, Genesis 3, you know, and it's like, and so when we're reading an English translation, you know, if you're going to read English, most of us do, read multiple, you know, and look at the major differences. Sometimes there's little minor things that aren't that important, you know, but look at like prepositions are big and gender is big. Like, you know, the word of the Lord came and he, that's big, you know, and so when things vary across English translations, we'll take note of what varies and understand that probably there's ambiguity there in the Hebrew word. Like, you know, when I taught Micah 6:8 here, and we'll get back to Genesis in a minute and finish up our 4.5-hour sermon. But we talked about how, you know, Micah 6:8, we all know it. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? And I've heard so many messages preached on what, you know, oh, you just have to have humility, brother. Like, before you can be exalted, you must be humble. And the problem is that little Hebrew word for humbly only appears anywhere in the world in that verse. So on what authority are we translating that word humbly? Tradition, usually. And sometimes there's really good tradition, but like that word, the Vulgate, Jerome's edition, the Latin edition that Jerome did directly in Jerusalem, doesn't have the same thing. It doesn't have the word humbly. I can't remember which one it has. They all vary. The Greek translation, which is an older translation than the Hebrew Bible that we have, has something different. And there is a word for humbly in Greek. Okay, so, and that's not the word they choose. It's like be prepared or something like that. And so, and then there's another one, the Syriac is even different. It doesn't choose humbly either. So there's some ambiguity. You run into these things. There are so they call them hapax. It means they appear one time in the text. And some of these words appear outside the Bible a little bit, but most of them don't. And so when we've got something that the only reference to it is one time in the Bible among 36,000 verses, we got to be careful with like what kind of assurance we're placing our doctrinal beliefs on that. See, Micah says you have to be humble. If I'm reading Latin, I think it says to be prepared. And if I'm reading Greek, it says to be able, or, I mean, no, not really. It doesn't say be humble. It does in English, you know, but there's ambiguity there. So there's open room for interpretation. And like what I like to say in response to people who say, well, this is a lot of data, is it's good. That's what you need. You know, and it might seem like it's too much data, but you know what? We've been fed a lot of interpretation for a lot of years. And people come and they say, well, this means this. Really? Does it? And now the information is free. And you don't have to go get your degree to check someone's Greek and Hebrew. You can take a couple of online classes for free. Learn how to at least pronounce the Greek and Hebrew alphabets so that you can look up words when someone says, this means this. And there are places you can go look the stuff up for free and you can check people. You know, but I'd rather just give you data and give you what respected scholars are saying, and it's not that scholars, they do write the books, but it's not that they own things, it's that the community builds itself. You know, and anybody you've probably done some like technical writing, you know, that has to be submitted to a community of people and you get peer review, and this is important. You know, and that's all dead. No, it's not. What it is it's a group of people who all know this stuff very, very well. And when someone tries to say something like there's a particular teaching going around right now, and it's kind of like an off-whack teaching, but it's that you can basically say that Genesis 1:1 should read that the Father in the beginning created the Elohim. Garbage. Okay? And it's garbage because there's nowhere ever anywhere that there's a manuscript that says anything close to that. And so in the scholarly community, someone would look at that and they'd say, no, and that's because we don't have any manuscripts. This is garbage. And it wouldn't fly. But in the church, you preach that and people go, oh, that's interesting. I want to give to your ministry. And it grows, and then you get a TV show, and then you send out monthly letters. Okay, so now let's go down to the covenant. Some of this may be repeat for some of you, and I'm going to turn this because this is actually an image I had to take. But I want to read it. This is Nahum Sarna. He says, the peculiar phrase to cut a covenant is derived from the practice of severing animals as the seal of a treaty. This custom is widely attested in ancient times and exists among the primitive peoples to this day. Particularly interesting are Hittite and Greek parallels. It is generally believed that when the contracting parties passed between the severed pieces, they thereby accepted the covenant obligations and invoked upon themselves the fate of the animals if the terms of the pact were violated. But how could this latter apply to God? Obviously, for Christian interpretation, the latter applies to God because God becomes a man and lets us kill him. You know, for our covenant violation, because he's the only one here. We'll do more on that in just a second. The smoke and flame are frequent symbols of the divine presence in biblical theophanies, accounts of God's self-manifestation, and it is only these that passed between the pieces. Abraham did not participate. Only God bound himself to a solemn obligation, the patriarch having been the passive beneficiary. Okay, and then the rest of that I'm not going to read. This is from Christine Hayes, who is a professor at Yale, and she teaches on the quote, secular side of religious studies and teaches Old Testament studies. In a suzerainty treaty, and we'll talk about this in just a second, the suzerain, who is a landowner or a ruler, enters a covenant with someone with the divided animal as reference to what will happen to the party who breaks the agreement. And she says, the striking thing about the Abrahamic covenant is its unilateral character. Only Yahweh is obligated by the covenant, obligated to fulfill the promise he has made. Abraham does not appear to have any obligation in return. Hear that clearly. Okay, no matter what word of faith or insert modern offshoot Protestant denomination here wants to say, Abraham had no part in the covenant. Okay. Thus, it is the subject Abraham and not the suzerain Yahweh who is benefited by this covenant, and a reversal of the reader's expectations. Moreover, the biblical writer goes out of his way to provide a moral justification for the grant of this land to Israel. In the biblical writer's view, Yahweh is the owner of the land, empowered to establish residency requirements for those who would live in it. The current inhabitants were polluting the land with bloodshed and idolatry. When the land is completely polluted, it will spew out its inhabitants. Until this expulsion, the descendants of Abraham will have to wait, for the iniquity of Amorites is not yet complete. Here, and even more explicitly, Deuteronomy 9:5, the Bible makes it clear that Yahweh's covenant with Israel is not due to any special merit or favoritism, or in other words, it is a covenant of grace. In the Old Testament, you can't find grace. Yeah, no, it's all over, it's fine. Rather, Yahweh seeks replacement tenants who, unlike the previous tenants, will follow the rules of residence that he has established for his land. So a few things to note here, and that's the end of Hayes' quote. The rules of residence are all relating to the land. Okay, and that needs to kind of sink in as we think about how we approach Old Testament law. Okay, they are rules of residence. If you're going to live here and worship me, here's what you're going to do. Okay? So something we need to take from that is, therefore, people 7,000 to 10,000 years from now are not subject to these laws. And especially those who don't live in this land. right? Because these are rules of residence for being in the land. When God gives the law, like notice when God talks to Adam in the garden, there's no law. There's a, hey, don't eat that tree because it'll kill you. I mean, that's really what God says. If God was like a hipster parent with a beard, you know, he'd be like, man, that one will kill you. Don't eat it. And that would be that. That's not a law. That's a warning. Okay? I mean, you can take it as a law if you want to. That's fine. But in the sense of divine laws, when do those come about? Exodus. Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is in the land. Okay? So God doesn't give laws to them. He doesn't give laws to Adam after the fall. He doesn't give laws to Cain. He protects Cain, who is a murderer. You know, he does all kinds of things that are kind of really in violation of the law later on because he's not concerned about it. Okay? And again, this is a covenant of grace where the ancient suzerain would have made himself and the subject pass through the animal. So a suzerain is a landowner. There's someone, they can be a king, but they don't have to be. Okay, so there's someone who is powerful and has the ability to make a covenant of like protection and a covenant of peace with like, say, a herdsman who has a small clan that he travels with. And so the suzerain would say, you know what, here's my terms. You know, what we're going to do is you're going to live peaceably with my people. I'm going to let you graze on my land. That's fine. But the second that there's any war, this is what's going to happen. You know, and they would cut open the animal, and they would both pass through the animal and say, okay, so be it to me. And the interesting thing about this is that this is the only covenant in all of the ancient Near Eastern literature, I believe, where the deity is the sole actor in the covenant and doesn't require anything of the human. And so again, you know, sometimes the Bible is important simply because of where it's unique. You know, and what it says. And sometimes it's important where it's mirroring its culture. And then, like, you find, again, it's a unique thing, but you find where it kind of goes whoop and twists things. And it's like, oh, like we saw with the flood, right? There's no reason to say, oh, God killed millions and millions of people or hundreds of thousands or whatever, because that's just not the point. You know, the point is we all know about this thing that happened. We're going to say our God did it, and now let us tell you why and what he's working through this. Oh, the gradual restoration of all things. Okay. And again, just note that Abraham has no part to play whatsoever in this covenant. And Abraham believes, but he doesn't have a part to play in the covenant. His belief is a result. Okay. Then in 1511, the birds of prey come down. And this again, Sarna says that these may be indicative of Horus, who is one of the Egyptian gods, and the raven and dark birds represented him. And Abraham drives the birds of prey off of the covenant that's just been made, right? And so what may be being said in this story by, and this is where I do see editorial hands later on, it probably, the story had some elements that said God made a covenant with Abraham. And that was the oral tradition that came down, and somewhere along the line, the idea of these birds of prey got added in because of the Exodus. So remember, we're always kind of leapfrogging back and forth in time. When we're reading the Bible, there's ancient texts that have, to them, modern ideas imported back into them. Okay, because they're always reworking themselves, and they're always reworking their idea of God and his relationship with Israel and how that works. So then Horus then is this god of Egypt, and Abraham's driving them off represents, you know, God's covenant people driving off the Egyptian overlords from the covenant. So this is something that Sarna says you could interpret from this verse. You know, and some people do that, and there's not a lot of extra textual evidence for it, but it's doable. And then in verse 12, and this is another instance of biblical interpretation gone wild. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abraham, and behold, horror and a great darkness fell upon him. And, I mean, he got scared and it got dark, but the Septuagint says that he fell into an ecstatic trance. And why they did that, I don't know. Sometimes they base that on an older Hebrew manuscript. Sometimes it's just they made a choice. And sometimes they made a mistake. This doesn't seem like a mistake. It seems like the translator just made a choice and said, I decided it should be an ecstatic trance instead. Okay, now we're going to read about 36 pages. Not really. But we're going to contextualize these last, and you don't ever think, oh, well, the people groups, those are important. The people groups are really important. So when the Bible gives you generation lists and people group lists, those are important. They don't mention, you don't mention that guy Gary if he doesn't do something important, at least to the story at that point, or isn't known to your audience, right? Like, who ran against, the 16th president of the United States? Who was the loser? I don't know. Some history nerd might remember. But you didn't do much, so you don't record that name for good reason. Oh, he lost. So-and-so. Like, that's what happens in Ruth. Oh, so-and-so. Who cares about his name? But when they record a name, there's a reason. And typically when they give you people groups, it's because they're drawing you a map. And so if you'll get an ancient Near Eastern map and you look at, start looking for where these people groups are, and you can kind of take a colored pencil and after the flood, draw a map around, play connect the dots. And that's kind of what you would take as this is the area of the world that was flooded. Because this is where the people groups are. And so what was it beyond that? Don't know, but Egypt and China don't say so. And they're beyond that realm. So it helps us. And again, does that? Are you saying the Bible's wrong? No, the Bible doesn't say that the globe was flooded. It says the Eretz was flooded. And again, Eretz doesn't mean globe; it means earth, but it means like dirt, earth, or land. It doesn't mean earth as we think of a object in space that has other objects floating around it. They didn't know about that. So Eretz is land. So when they say the land was flooded, the world was flooded, they're not necessarily saying the entire earth was underwater and every dinosaur was buried. They're saying everything that we could see had water on it. All of our land was gone. We saw that in Colorado a few years ago. Our world was flooded. And without news, without internet, without smartphones, some of us who were in some of the deeper parts would have thought the world was flooded because it was deep and wide. It was and the Spring Creek flood, and we've had these here. It happens. So to further contextualize Abraham and this whole, when you hear the word cycle, that means story. Okay, it's a way of talking about the life cycle of the character. And usually when, scholars call it the Abraham cycle, they're saying it's a work of fiction. We talked about how last time I don't think that's correct. I think that it's based in real memory of an actual person handed down orally and all that. So this is from the Anchor Bible Dictionary, and it's a pretty long article on the Amorites who appear in this list, right, at the end of the chapter here. It says, to the east, the disappearance of the Old Akkadian language and its replacement by Old Babylonian and Old Assyrian is most probably the result of Amorite influence in Mesopotamian speech and eventually writing. A similar but not identical process took place in the west. The old coastal Semitic of the Biblo-syllabic texts was replaced by a complex of local dialects that have long been termed Canaanite, but all of which exhibit a blend of the older dialect with a very strong influence from Amorite that can be traced especially in proper names and vocabulary. I know this is technical, and I'm sorry, but it's important. In contrast to the east, now let's just break it down real quick. Akkadian is kind of the old Babylonian language. Akkad was their land, and Sargon was kind of the historic ruler. There's a lot of mythology about Sargon too. He has kind of the Moses origin story, right? His mom is ashamed of his birth and throws him in a river, and this goddess rescues him and sets him over the land of Akkad as the king, okay? And so all of these stories, all of these, when you start reading, I've got 3 sets of books. One's called Outside the Bible, another's called The Context of Scripture, and another's called Ancient Near Eastern Texts Relating to the Old Testament. And within all of these texts, you see undeniable parallels with many of the biblical texts, and they're immensely helpful in learning what the Bible is doing. You know, we've gotten so bogged down in a scientific approach to the Bible in our Christian minds of scientific, in trying to say, no, the Bible's telling us history. No, it's not. You know, at every point, it's doing theology and polemic, and it's arguing with its own culture and what it views as a coming culture, and it's arguing with itself, you know, a lot of times. And so there's a lot going on here that I think when we approach it in that historical way, we actually, it'd be like me marrying Gabby and then making her stay at home all the time. And, she's way too pretty for that. You know, she's got to get out in public, and I need to walk like this with her. And, you know, that's what it's like when we treat the Bible like that, though. Like, oh, you can only have one lens, and it must be perfection. Well, crud. You know, the most disrespectful thing you can do to your spouse, your loved one, is to demand perfection from them. And you say you love them, so if you love the Bible, quit demanding perfection from it, because that's not what it's trying to do. I put up on my Facebook this morning a quote from John J. Collins. He's an important person. He's another Yale guy, does Hebrew Bible stuff there, and does specifically apocalyptic work. And I'm just going to pull up my Facebook because it's totally worth reading in this context, and then we'll get back to my notes. He says, the portrayal of the Bible as a source of infallible truth does not arise from a reading of the Bible itself, but is a monstrous imposition upon it, even if it is one backed by a long tradition. And so what he's saying is, this isn't the language that the Bible is speaking. You know, the idea of inerrancy as we understand inerrancy today comes from December 1978. I mean, the idea of the fathers, the church fathers in the early church, and how they understood things like infallibility is different. I know, that's why God called me to correct that heresy. It's a sign. No, I mean, it just is, inerrancy is like asking a symphony to paint you a picture, an orchestra. That's not how it works. It's the wrong language. It's not, you know, infallibility is different. Infallibility has to do with what it's speaking to and what it's saying, and a lot of that's based in our interpretation. But inerrancy is a factual thing. It's like, well, there are errors if you're going to take everything as must be factual or not. But that's a lot of times not what they're even doing. So then you're left with this mental gymnastic of, well, I can believe it for the parts. Okay, well, tell me which parts are. You know, you go through the 36,000 plus verses and just let me know, and then we'll all follow that. Like I said, I totally am an inspiration, and I'm okay with infallibility and expressed a certain way. But let's get back to this quote, because that has nothing to do with it. Okay, so in contrast to the East, where the older Akkadian disappeared entirely, the basic structure of the older language, the old coastal Semitic, survived in various fringe areas from Lebanon to the Sinai Peninsula, and eventually became iterate in the inscriptions of Old North Arabic and Old South Arabic. Historically more important, however, and this is the big part, is increasing evidence suggesting that venerable cultural and religious traits all over the ancient Near East have Amorite origins. Long ago, it was noted that the myth of cosmic conflict was probably Amorite in origin. Now, the myth of cosmic conflict, we talked about this last time. In the beginning, the waters of the world were what? Dark and chaotic, or tohu vabohu is what the Hebrew says. And the way to summarize those words is without order. They were chaotic. Okay, but the Spirit of the Lord hovered over the chaos and then began to create out of these chaotic waters, right? Primordial waters. So what this Anchor Bible article is saying, that this idea of cosmic conflict, that comes from, like we talked about Babylon's, their deity killing each other and bringing creation. That comes from Amorite origins. So the Bible's response, the Hebrew response to this God who creates out of chaos and murder and death, is to offer a God who doesn't, who hovers over the chaos with peace and begins to create with his words. Okay? So it's Amorite in origin. It was adapted by the East in the Babylonian creation epic, and that's the Enuma Elish, and in the West in the Ugaritic myth of the conflict of Baal and Yam. Baal, and we know that name, Baal, if you're from America. That's how you say his name. And he is the god of many Canaanites, but the word just means Lord, and in fact, in modern Hebrew now, when a woman is talking about her husband, she calls him her Baali, which means my husband, but it could be translated my Lord. So it doesn't mean Lord like ruler, it's just a word that has multiple meanings like many of our words. Okay, but this particular Baal, this guy, is a deity also. Okay, and in the Ugaritic myth, Baal defeats Yam and becomes the supreme leader, basically. And Yam is the god of the sea. Sorry. Okay. Yam is the god of the sea, and this is just a fun little tidbit. And in Hebrew, the word for sea is, want to take a stab? It's Yam. It's the same word. They do the same thing. And Shemesh is the god of the sun in these Ugaritic texts. And do you want to take a wild stab at what the Hebrew word for sun is? Shemesh. So what are they doing? These aren't deities, they're created objects. So, I mean, even in the way that they write their texts and where these words come from, they import words that are known to be names of deities. Asherah is the female consort of Yahweh in other texts, not the Bible, obviously. Okay? So these are names that they turn into objects. They like de-deify the ancient deities just in writing a simple story. And because we're reading someone else's interpretation most of the time, we don't get that. We say, oh, yeah, well, you set up your Asherah, that's a pole. Kinda. But it's also talking about a very specific thing. And it would have invoked like a very specific meaning. You know, embodied meaning is a thing that says, when I utter a word, it has a certain context to you immediately, right? Like, it comes to mean something to you. Okay, and so in our modern context, the word religion, right, and especially in certain Christian circles, has a very negative context. But religion is not a negative word. You know, as a modern word, it simply is practices. Nothing negative about it. Has no evil law, legalism connotation to it. You know, but those of us who are afraid of regulation in our lives, we like to say, oh, well, anything that has a rule is religion. Yeah. And we use it negatively. Okay, I'm not arguing which one is right and which one is wrong, but what I'm saying is, when I say the word religion, each of us has a meaning that comes into our mind. Okay, so it's the same kind of thing when they use a deity's name as an object. Oh, you set up your Baals, your idols. You know, it's like it's a depersonification of the being. It's a slap in the face of the opposing theology. It's like your God is nothing but a created thing. Okay. Accompanying the mythical motifs, the Amorite deities Dagon, Hadad, and Anat become established in the West, superimposed on earlier deities of Atharat and Yam. And Il and Baal. Il is related to El, which is the Hebrew and Ugaritic and Canaanite high deity. And Baal, whose proper name is unknown, but who is later identified with the Amorite storm god Hadad. So when we get the Bible saying he rides on the clouds, right? That's imagery from Baal's cult, from the group that worshipped Baal. And that they borrowed that from the Amorite deity Hadad. Okay, so you see what's kind of happening? Like, a lot of borrowing is going on in the religious cultures of this day. And the Bible does not get produced in a vacuum. Okay. The details of the process remain to be worked out, but the syncretistic process itself can hardly be questioned. Furthermore, it is now possible to trace, at least in theory, the reasons for the extremely close parallels between biblical and Old Babylonian literary works. And that's specifically talking about Genesis 1 to 11. Okay. It is virtually certain that such motifs as the flood story were mediated in the Palestinian region through North Syrian versions of an old Amorite narrative. However, much more impressive is the earliest biblical law code of Exodus 21 to 23. Its striking similarities to the Code of Hammurabi and other Mesopotamian law codes reflect their common derivation from Amorite traditions and customary law. So the Amorites are all over the Bible and we just don't know it. This is what this is saying, okay? I want us to get that. Probably the single most important Amorite contribution to the biblical tradition was the Abraham narrative in Genesis. What? Which was in all probability a specifically Palestinian epic tradition for the art. No, I'm not going to read that note. In spite of the fact that it has been thoroughly reworked to fit the political concerns of a much later period, the basic structure of the narrative fits entirely the nature of the historical process of Amorite migrations attested in the Bronze Age sources. From infiltration to political control legitimized through a divine gift of the land. Finally, it should be noted that some of the most important concepts in the theological vocabulary of the Hebrew Bible are either demonstrably or probably of Amorite origin. Foremost is the concept of divine deliverance that became the concept of salvation, expressed in various forms of the root, and it gives the root here like Yeshua, and Joshua's name means salvation in Hebrew, so it's that root. At least 16 gods and divine epithets appear as subjects of the verb to save in the Amorite personal names. Other key theological terms that are probably Amorite are tzaddik, which is righteousness, nikam, which is vindication, yashar, which is upright, shafat, which is to judge, chesed, which is faithful, and perhaps zakar, which is remember. So then he says, in summary, from the Middle Bronze Age on, there was no region of the Levant, which is the area that Israel is trying to obtain, that had not been influenced by the Amorite language and culture in various ways and various degrees. Their culture and linguistic influence was a lasting one that is gradually coming to light, especially in the areas of religion and law. Past generations of scholars credited the Babylonians with these cultural achievements. However, it now appears that the Babylonians themselves were merely the recipients, in part the product, and to some degree the vectors of the ancient Amorite village heritage until they succumbed to the perpetual temptation of urban imperialism. Don't we all? It is equally clear that the Amorite populations were themselves drastically modified by the various cultures into which they became integrated in the later phases of the Bronze Age, and then they went away. So what this is basically saying is that behind the Abraham cycle, behind this Abraham story, there lies a known motif of Amorite origin. Okay, so it is probably of no small consequence that the author of this, how it ended up in the biblical text, included the Amorites in this list of people group. Okay, so it's a small kind of nudge at, we're borrowing your story and we're dispossessing you. Okay. Now we're going to talk about these groups, and some of this is going to become very, very important as we progress on. And so getting the historical background now and getting it locked in who some of these people groups are and why they even why do the Amorites come up in the Bible? They don't seem to do anything particularly wrong in the sense of it just says the guilt of the Amorites is not yet complete. And so, it's now there's some reasons for what's been said, but they're just not like a major player, and all of a sudden they appear. Well, let's look at the rest of these people too, and then we'll try and wrap up here. The Kenites They're the direct descendants of Cain. They're a semi-nomadic. Their name means smith or like metal worker. Okay? That Hebrew root, Cain, means like smith. So wandering in the southern part of the land and connected with both the Midianites and the Amalekites. And the Kenites are going to become important. Now they're in the land, right? They're in this place where Abraham has met who? Yahweh, the Lord. So notice that Abraham has journeyed out of his homeland and into another land, and now he's met the Lord. But it's like, so who are all these people? Where did they come from? You know, some of them are listed in the people lists back before. Some of them we need to kind of look at. Some of them there's no other reference anywhere other than like right here. And then some of them are only referenced in the Bible a couple times, but nowhere outside the Bible by any of the like Assyrians or Phoenicians or the groups that conquered the areas. So what do we do with all these? And my theory is, and I have reasons for this, but not everybody's going to agree with it. My theory is a lot of the reason that they do what they do with names and the way they include certain people groups has to do with what's coming at the end of the Pentateuch. Okay, and so we've got, like, you got to think of this as like, this is not a 30-minute Simpsons episode. Okay? This is an 8-volume extended edition Lord of the Rings box set. And everything is leading towards something else.
Oh, that's cool.
But like the Lord of the... Like what's the grand thing that's supposed to happen? I'm sorry if you haven't read these books yet, then wow. Or seen the movies. Like, but they're trying to destroy the ring. Right? We know this. What's the grand thing going on at the end of the Pentateuch? The conquest of the Holy Land. So all throughout the buildup, all throughout the Fellowship of the Ring, and you know all the movies and The Hobbit and all these that are before, there are always going to be parts built in that we need to take note of. Oh, well, you're going to dispossess these people and these people and these people and these people and these people. And why? Because they're on the banks of the Jordan. And you need to know that God has a covenant with you, that this land is your land. The Kenizzites, the name indicates a Hurrian origin, but this people has close ties with the Edomites, as is clear from Genesis 36. They were later absorbed into the tribe of Judah, or at least some of their most important clans were, and they provided one of the minor judges of Israel. Okay, these are people that are getting dispossessed, and yet later on become a judge. Cadmonites, these are mentioned in no other biblical ethnographic source. They may well be identical with Kedemites, Easterners, a general term for the tribes that roamed the Syro-Palestinian desert from Aram in the north down to the Red Sea in the south of Canaan. In the south of Canaan, the Kedemites were associated with the Amalekites and Midianites. They were also famous for their wisdom. The Hittites, and we all know this name. Now, up in chapter... I think it's in chapter 10. It's at the end of the flood when they're giving the people group list. And it's the generations of whoever, so-and-so begot this person, begot this person, begot this person. Het is mentioned. Okay, and I talked about what they're doing is they're setting up the known nations at the time of the writing of the flood narrative. Okay, so Het is mentioned, and Het is the person who is kind of the eponymous ancestor of the Hittites. So this is still continuing on. Undoubtedly, Het is taken here to be a personal name, that of the ancestor of the Hittites. And he's talking about chapter 10 here where this list appears. That of the ancestor of the Hittites. This term, like Canaan, Canaanite, is noticeably imprecise. Around 1800 BCE, an Indo-European people who had settled in Asia Minor and had taken over the name of the earlier inhabitants, the Hatti, founded an empire. The name Hittite was gradually extended to the entire region, and the peoples incorporated within it. After the Hittite Empire collapsed around 1200 BCE, and the city-states of Assyria became independent, they continued to call themselves Hittite for several centuries, Assyrian and Babylonian records regularly used Hatti land to refer to the whole of Syria and Palestine. In the present context, Het probably refers to the Neo-Hittite states of Syria. So this is a good indication, again, of the age of the story that we're talking about. You know, in 600-700 years, when some of the more kind of flamboyantly liberal, I don't know, some of the more, let's just say, secular scholars who don't necessarily want to do anything religious with the Bible, what they'll say is, well, everything in the Pentateuch was written after the Babylonian exile. And that's like 689 BCE. So when you have some stuff, though, that is pretty firm from 1800 BCE to 12, I mean, that's too far in memory for that to be a later invention. You know, little things like that are clues that, no, this story is actually very, very old. And whether it was written then, that's fine, don't care. I mean, we all write things at different times. That doesn't mean that's when it happened. In fact, rarely do you write, like you don't write or walk around writing your, like narrating your life in book form. And then the Lord said, pull into Wendy's. But don't eat the bacon. The Perizzites, this name is also paired with the Canaanites in 34:30 and in Judges 1:4-5, because Hebrew Perazzi here means a hamlet dweller as opposed to the inhabitants of a walled city, as in Deuteronomy 3:5. Canaanites and Perizzites in these passages may refer respectively to those who dwell in walled cities and to those who dwell in open country. So they're not necessarily listing a people group here, but making a distinction between those who are within these walled cities, generally called Canaanites, and then those who are living outside the city wall, trying to get through the wall, called Perizzites. That's what evangelicals call them still. In these passages, I already read that part. So, and again, nothing is known of them from extra biblical sources. So it seems to just be a way that they talk about people who don't live in cities, is what he's saying. The Rephaim, and the last part of all what we're doing right now is information, because as we lead into the rest of Genesis, the Bible gets extraordinarily supernatural very quickly. And what I don't mean is, from Genesis on, you see God putting money in people's wallets. What I mean is, there are beings talked about in the Bible as existing that we don't believe in today, for whatever, or some of us do, you know. And what I caution people is, it's very easy to say, well, that's mythology, or, well, that's just silly. Really? You believe in an invisible sky being that impregnated a woman. You know, so what the relative scale of silliness in what we believe, I don't think needs to come in here, but the Bible says some things that get very uncomfortable to our modern scientific minds. Okay, like we read in the flood story that the sons of God came down and impregnated the sons of men. That's weird. What do we do with that? Some people genuinely believe that Nephilim were real beings, that were giants. Awesome. That is what the Bible says. Other people believe that that's, like me, that this is a derogatory way of talking about people who are different. You know, so giant, Nephilim, I mean, historical Israel is very short. Like, short. I don't mean like length of time, I mean like they aren't very tall. And so a giant is other, right? A real, like not just someone who's tall. Like if you're 5'4", someone who, like, my son is 5'8" now and I'm 5'4". And so, I mean, that's, yeah, but he's not a giant. You know, I mean, again, his bed is 13 feet long. So someone like that is like, that's almost 3 times my size. All of a sudden, that becomes something that can't possibly be human in any way. And maybe they weren't. I don't know. I wasn't there. You know, and so to flippantly toss things, I think, is as wrong as insisting that it all must be historically factual.
I think it both need to kind of like come to the middle and say, let's have some movement here to talk about at least to acknowledge openly the worldview of the Bible. And the worldview of the Bible includes other deities and beings, supernatural beings. Okay, it's not, in the beginning there was God and nothing else. You know, there's angels, and there are, in later texts, there are demons, and in certain parts of the Hebrew Bible, you have things like these Rephaim. And he says, this people listed among the early pre-Israelite inhabitants of the land in Genesis 15:20 had all but disappeared by the time of Exodus, as Deuteronomy 2:20 and 3:11 attest. Popular imagination endowed them with the attributes of aboriginal giants. Their habitat was the region of Bashan. So Og of Bashan is the king of the Rephaim, is kind of how the myth goes. The northernmost part of the area east of the Jordan. Elsewhere, the term Rephaim refers to the shades of the dead, a meaning that it also has in Phoenician and Punic. The word appears in Ugaritic texts in the singular as the name of a god and in the plural as denizens of the underworld. So this isn't like just necessarily talking about like a people group. They really seem to think that like there are monsters, basically, called Rephaim. And in some way they're related to the world of the dead. What do you do with that? You know, do you toss it? I don't think so. Do you believe it as like were there zombies back then? No, I mean, you know, the laws of science are the laws of science, and, you know, truth is truth no matter when it is. And so I'm not going to say much there other than to leave that open. If you're interested, like if that realm of things in the Bible interests you, some people, it couldn't be further from your mind, you don't care, you know, fine. But if it does, there's a scholar named Michael Heiser who is like, that's his world. Like his whole wheelhouse. I don't agree with some of his theology, and some of his methodology I think is a little wonky, but that, like, he lives in that world. He's got a book called Supernatural, and another one called The Unseen Realm. And Supernatural is shorter, Unseen Realm is longer. They're kind of the same book, but they go into all this, and everything that the Bible talks about, other characters that aren't God or humans. Okay? So you can check that out on your own. Have fun with that. Amorites, they appear as a distinct ethnic group in all the lists of the pre-Israelite peoples of the land. Of course they did, because they were actually there. In the course of time, the term lost all ethnic significance in the Bible and, like Canaanite, came to be employed as a general designation for them all, as, for instance, in 1516. And we just kind of talked about this with that Anchor Bible article. The Amorites were there, and they kind of just blended into society and became part of the society that they were in. The Amaru, as they were called in Akkadian, were a West Semitic people who had first appeared in Babylonia in the significant numbers about 2000 BCE, having migrated from the fringes of the Syrian desert. In subsequent centuries, successive waves of Amorites infiltrated the entire Fertile Crescent. In the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, cuneiform texts refer to a state north of Canaan called Amaru. And then from Girgashites to Jebusites, nothing is known about these people from outside the Bible. Okay, so we've got this big list of people groups. I've given you some historical context for them. But at the end of the day, what did we say at the beginning? We said that the laws and all this is given for residents in the land, right? So that means that in some way, shape, or form, these people groups are disobeying the law of Yahweh. Does that mean that he's punishing them for ignorant acts? Just think about it for a second. Okay, what does this mean? If you're in any way familiar with the Moses story, you see this obscure Kenite priest called a priest of the Most High, or called a priest of Yahweh. He's a Kenite priest, and he's a priest of Yahweh. Just keep getting it through your head. Okay, he's not an Israelite, and he's already in the land, and he's worshiping Yahweh, which means Yahweh is attached to the land, right? And throughout the Hebrew Bible, this is important, because what we don't get is that 99% of the proscriptions and laws and all the stuff, let me tell you, like I'm trying to read through the Hebrew Bible right now in Hebrew, and there is nothing more boring than the infectious skin disease sections of Leviticus in Hebrew. Nothing. I mean, I just can't state enough. How many times do you need to say if you have a pimple and it has a black hair in it? Like, oh, boring. But you know what? As boring as they are, they don't apply to any of us in any way, shape, or form because we don't live in the Holy Land. The Holy Land lives in us. I mean, that's the message of Christianity. Okay, and this is why it's important, right? We're going to do a bit of theology now. This is why it's important that we understand that Paul's statement that the wages of sin is death is a telescoping of what actually happens. You don't sin and die in the Old Testament. You sin and you are exiled from the land because the land is connected to your deity. Okay? And so the wages of sin is exile, and exile is death because you're not with God. That's the idea, right? And when we lose this idea, and I've said this before here, but like sometimes in grace-friendly churches or whatever, we don't, we like to say, oh, God didn't send them out of the garden. It was just a result. No, God sent them. He exiled them. Oh, God didn't do this. God didn't do that. No, he exiled them. He says in Ezekiel, I am bringing the razor of Babylon against you. I'm sending you into exile. And we're like, I don't like that. Well, look at what they were doing. You might not like that so much either. Literally everything that God had said to Israel, and look, again, we're not going to do the historicity argument. I don't do that because you weren't there, you can't get there, and no one can argue that. And so what we have to do is say, what is the story saying? And the story is saying that literally everything that God had said he was to them, they went off looking for from other gods. Yeah. He says, I am the Lord your healer, and they went to Egypt looking for healing. Yeah, and they looked to other gods. And then Ezekiel really drives the nail home when he says, and you made male images and played the harlot with them at Yahweh's altar. And what he's saying is you fashion golden sex toys and use them in front of me. So it's like you have all of this. Yeah, you know what? I don't like a God of judgment either. It doesn't give me the warm fuzzies. But at least you can understand why Ezekiel says the razor of Babylon is coming against you and it is my hand doing it. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they had in every way violated everything that it's like Torah is not exclusion. The biggest change during my deconstruction was leaving behind the grace law. The Old Testament is law. Yeah. Torah is meant for inclusion. Torah is meant to say, hey, if you want to worship Yahweh, here's how you do it. That's it. And Jesus and Paul get pissed off because people are using Torah to say, no. Now you're no longer good. You can't be righteous apart from Torah. And he's like, that's not what it's about, guys. It's not about being righteous. It's about here's how to worship God. And we don't, Leviticus is ugly. We don't like it. It's, there's all these sacrifices. There's a lot of blood. But Leviticus starts off with, if you sacrifice, here's how you do it. It doesn't say, bring me a bull. It says, if a man. And frequently throughout the book, it says, and if anyone. Meaning a woman can do it too. Doesn't have to be a man. It's like this big, inclusive, open, here's how you're going to worship in the context of what worship looks like 3000 BCE. A pacifist cult that danced around like charismatics do would have been annihilated in the ancient world. But one that looks like the other groups, the other groups offered sacrifices, most of them indiscriminately. The sacrifices of Leviticus are from a select few minor animals, not many. You can't just go wild picking anything you want, and if you're too poor for the animals, you can do grain, it's fine. Because you're going to sacrifice, so let's do it this way. Don't bathe yourself in blood. That's good. Don't slaughter anything you want. Only slaughter these things. There's another one that I want to say here. But this is the laws, right? And what's the point in Leviticus? And we're not even in Leviticus yet, but what's the point? Is the point in Leviticus to say, and therefore your sin will be forgiven? No, it's to make atonement. And they usually are making atonement for the land, because the land has been polluted by sin. Not the person, the land. Sin doesn't pollute the person in the Levitical context. It pollutes the land. And since it's Yahweh's land, since he's the landowner, he's outlined, here's what it looks like to live in my land. Now this is going to apply later. Again, I have made little mentions of this, but this applies massively to the discussion on homosexuality in the Old Testament. Because these laws are only given to people who are living in the land. So no matter how you interpret Leviticus, it's only given to someone living in the land. B, the word just isn't going to be there. And C, no, we won't go there now. So here we have Abraham. God has made a covenant with him that is a covenant of grace. Interestingly enough, this is only 15 chapters into the Bible. And we've already seen Noah who found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And you don't find something you're not looking for. It wasn't like, oh, there it is, oops. He was looking. He was like, and he found grace. And then this Abrahamic covenant is a covenant of grace. It's not a covenant that requires that Abraham believe for it to be effective. What it is God has made a covenant and said, okay, that's my covenant. Do you want it? And Abraham's like, okay, that sounds good. But he questions him in the beginning. God appears to him before he officially confesses that Yahweh is God. He doesn't have to pray a prayer for Yahweh to appear to him. He's already kind of like seeking, just doing his thing. He's already, you don't need to be out looking for Jesus. Because typically what happens if we take the biblical reference as valid at all is that God is constantly looking for people, right? And I've said this before, but this story, it's the same story over and over and over. It just keeps getting recycled. It's God is pursuing his people, period. And Jesus tells the story in Luke 15 as a coin and a sheep and a lost son. And God is pursuing his people, and that's the point. And so then you said he exiles. He does, but then watch what he does after he exiles. He's like, poof, and then he comes out with them. Yeah. And there's nothing more incarnational than to exile. Like I exile my kids when they get in a fight. Go to your rooms away from each other. That's exile. You are not in my presence anymore because you're annoying me. No, not that God is like that. But after he exiles, he comes out with them. So he exiles them from the garden. He's like, but it's not good for man to be alone as a reflection of how I feel about myself, so I'm going to come out here. And then he lives with them and comes to them, and then they screw up again, and he's like, and he has to exile them again. He's like, but I'm going to come here with you too. It's boring over there where there's no people. There's a bunch of dead ones, and they're starting to smell. And then the ultimate exile is that God sends them off in the biblical story to the Babylonian exile, or to the second exile. And then, according to tradition, leaves them. And the Spirit is gone, and we have the silent years, and there's a bunch of writing that happens in that time, but God isn't speaking to people anymore according to their traditions. And so the people are living in exile and as like the result of their sin, and then God enters their exile, but not the way that he's done before. And they're all expecting this violent, messianic, I'm going to deliver you from your oppression king. And instead he comes out covered in afterbirth. And so he lives in exile with us as humans. And as a full human, meaning with the wages of that exile. Whether Jesus was crucified or died of old age, he'd have died. He didn't become incarnate man to be immortal. No, death had to be conquered. That's part of it. That's the exile that's been conquered, is death. Right? This is the Christian message. But what we've done is we've gotten so bound up in how we read the Old Testament that we don't let it tell the story that it's telling because we're trying to form doctrine every step of the way. Get your doctrine out of the way. It's fine. Lots of worse people than you existed before you, and God didn't wipe them out, so you're good. I call theology fan fiction. The story is the story is the story. It's in the Bible. It says what it says. It is what it is. You can't get around it. But we write some good fan fiction about that story and sell books and have CDs, and that's great. And there's a reason for that, and that helps people with their interpretation. But my job is not to help you interpret, but to give you the data so that you can start taking this and saying, look, I don't have to be afraid of Genesis 1 through 11. What if God killed all those babies in Canaan? You don't need to be afraid of what the stories say. Get the is it true out of your mind. That's not the question to ask. The question to ask is, what does the story say? And over and over and over and over and over, from Genesis to Revelation, God is pursuing his people. And it gets expanded. It starts off as just Adam. And then it becomes Abraham. And what's funny is we're oh yeah, God blessed Abraham, so Israel. Well, actually, Abraham had other kids. And those kids had other kids. And some of those other kids are called Kenites and Canaanites. And so these are people who, according to the Abrahamic covenant, are blessed by God and are in the blessed lineage of Abraham. And then you have one particular group who has decided that all of them must go away. And that gives you the framework for Joshua when we get there in 5 years. We're done.